by Steve Austin.
Chapter 4. Escape. It is Thursday, the 21st day of the month of Dharme. It is nearly 5 o'clock in the morning, and the sun is still slumbering just below the eastern horizon. Shanaeah muttered the spells Danine had taught her under her breath. She had to execute this perfectly if it were to work, and end her captivity. Time was growing short. She could hear Minerva instructing Scrog outside her cell door, just far enough away so she couldn't quite make out what was being said. The exchange of words ended, and she heard footsteps approach her cell. The door creaked open and Minerva strode through, alone this time. Minerva muttered,
"That fucking mindless cretin. The torch should have been extinguished after your feeding was concluded. No matter. All the light in Aeros won't alter your fate tonight, degenerate elven sprite."
Minerva walked around the torture rack Shanaeah was strapped to and stood at the head.
"And now comes the moment we have been awaiting. We shall open the chest again, and using the devices therein along with Marfo magic, we shall convert you, elven sprite, to a loyal subject of the Order of Panatesis, a loyal subject to your new lord and master, Minerva, daughter of Mahine."
With that, Minerva reached down and stroked Shanaeah's cheek. Shanaeah reacted like a mantis striking her prey. Danine had already freed her hands via the Incaptus Reversi spell. She seized Minerva's arm and slapped the condyle around her wrist, and muttered softly so the ogres wouldn't hear,
"Enclosis permente,"
which sealed the condyle around Minerva's wrist, blocking her ability to draw from the source of her magic, which in the case of a Marfo witch that source is deep within the earth, thus rendering her devoid of the ability to conjure or cast spells.
"Incaptus reversi."
This freed Shanaeah from the remainder of the bonds holding her to the table. Shanaeah stood and pointed at Minerva's face.
"Vocalis mortai."
Shanaeah murmured. This deprived Minerva of the ability to speak or yell.
"Incaptus minere."
This translates roughly to enslave the lower extremities. A swirling blur of light surrounded Minerva from her knees to the floor, making her incapable of walking or running.
"Mobilis."
As she said this, she pointed to a spot beside the exterior wall. Minerva glided across the floor involuntarily, and now stood a foot from the wall which separated Shanaeah from her freedom.
"Lumus tonissilis."
At this, Minerva began to claw frantically at the wall in front of her. The words of the spell translated to tunnel to the light. If you recall, Marfo witches have sharp, hard, talon-like nails on the ends of their long, webbed fingers. It was no exaggeration when we stated earlier that they could claw through a boulder. In a matter of minutes, Minerva had cut a hole in the wall a dragon could have walked through. Before she exited the dungeon through the excavation Minerva had just created, Shanaeah walked over and stood face to face with her incapacitated former captor and said,
"Farewell, sweet Palatar. Should we meet again, it shall be with me standing upon your throat."
Then, Shanaeah slapped Minerva's face, and then climbed through the hole she had cut to see Darvis, Pellegru, and Danine awaiting her.
"Can you run barefoot, milady?"
Darvis inquired.
"We brought clothing and boots for you, but we need to put a bit of distance between us and Rorsch before your spells wear off of Minerva."
"Over hot coals, if need be,"
said Shanaeah. She reached for Darvis and hugged him tightly, motioning for Pellegru to join them. As we stated before, Shanaeah had a deep love for gnomes, and these two were quite special to her. She stood and kissed her Auntie Danine on the cheek, and at that the three took off at a brisk clip, with Danine flying backward just above and behind them to act as a rear guard to alert them if, and when, the pursuit approached. They were making north up Praco Pass toward Pandana, the gnomish capital city, where preparation had already been made to receive them. But it was 9 miles from Rorsch to Pandana, a long journey for the poor elven sprite who had been starved for the last 4 days and imprisoned in a Proc ogre dungeon, not to mention having her wings clipped, which was devastating to a sprite on the level with sexual assault. It was indeed fortunate for Shanaeah that Minerva had fed her just prior to her escape, and fed her well. Not a feast to be sure, but the combination of the elvish bread, Marfo milk, and the tonic water, not to mention having her magic return, had rejuvenated her quite adequately. They had ran maybe a mile when Pellegru said,
"Darvis, perhaps it is time we get Milady shod before her lovely feet are damaged."
"Agreed,"
said Darvis.
"The foliage is thickening as we reach the edge of Panicheri Forest. We shall put some camouflage between us and the road and make a brief halt of it."
They turned aside to the right of the road and made their way about 100 yards into the thickening foliage, where they found a small clearing. They sat down, and Pellegru produced a large water skin from his pack and passed it around to the other members of the contingency. He said,
Tonic water. It will keep our eyes sharp and our limbs strong until we are safe in Pandena.
He fumbled around deeper in his pack and fished out a short tunic, a short pleated skirt, a pair of brief bloomers, and a pair of tanned leather boots.
Here, milady. These should fit you well, as they were made for you on the looms at the capital.
Very, very much obliged, my little darling.
Darvis and Deneen went to scout the road ahead. Shanaeah stood and began to dress. As she yanked the filthy loincloth the ogres had put on her off, she glanced back at Pellegru and noticed that he was staring intently and lovingly at her as she changed. She smiled at him and winked. She blew him a kiss, and then she donned the bloomers and skirt he had provided. It was so sweet to be looked upon, talked to and touched in a loving manner again, after the harsh and bitter treatment administered by Minerva and the ogres. Knowing they still needed to put distance between themselves and Minerva, he helped Shanaeah finish dressing. As he was aiding her in putting her boots on, Darvis and Deneen returned from scouting the road, and Darvis made this report.
The road is clear in both directions. Likely the spells you cast, milady, are still in effect, and Minerva has not been able to order the pursuit. But they won't last much longer, if they haven't faded already. We should get back on the road. We are still another 2.5 hours trek from Pandena, and ogres can cover distances at a tremendous clip.
Agreed. I will never allow that evil bitch to capture me again. Never.
With that, they started northward again at a slow jog. Gnomes, though they don't have quite the endurance proc ogres do, can cover shorter distances very quickly, and by pacing themselves are quite efficient at longer runs as well. So efficient, most of the message runners in Aeros were gnomish. Deneen, of course, can fly. That being the case, she was the rear guard, constantly flying back a 1/4 mile or so to gauge the pursuit. It would be about another 10 days before Shanaeah's wings grew back enough for her to defy gravity, but the Elvish and Minista in her genetic makeup made her quite capable during a march. An hour's time passed, and Darvis was beginning to worry. Deneen had departed just after they had left the clearing to check the pursuit, and had not returned. Had she been captured? An airborne sprite is difficult, though not impossible to subdue. Yes, they caught Shanaeah, but she was encamped and the ogres ambushed her. A skilled archer could take one down perhaps, but archery was not the strong suit of witches or ogres. Most witches are deadly accurate with the blowguns they use to dispatch Dusel darts, but the range of a blowgun is extremely limited. Ogres aren't versed in any advanced weaponry. Clubs, rocks, and knives are about the limit of their understanding. Deneen would have had to have done something disastrously careless to have been caught. As he continued to ponder Deneen's fate, he heard the flutter of dragonfly wings, and lo and behold, Deneen landed gently in front of them. Deneen said,
"We can halt and rest. They will not overtake us before we can reach Pandena."
At that, they left the road and sat down beneath a stand of willow trees. Pellegru pulled the water skin from his pack and gave everyone another long draw of the tonic water. After the dryness in her mouth was eliminated, Shanaeah asked,
Just how far behind us is the pursuit?
Shanaeah wanted to take no chances. Being recaptured and returning to the Rorshian dungeons was not an option she was willing to entertain at all. But Deneen answered her.
"There is no pursuit, dearie. My darling, you are going to become one very, very powerful sprite. As of when I left Minerva 15 minutes ago, she was still under all the spells you cast. Those spells, even when cast by an experienced sprite or witch, should only last for 20 minutes at the most. Cast by a novice such as yourself, I expected 5, maybe 10 minutes of hold time. Darling, Minerva, perhaps the most powerful Marfo witch walking Erosian soil, and the palatar of the current order, was still under your spells an hour after you cast them. That is remarkable, dearie. Absolutely remarkable."
We knew you were special, milady. From the time you were but a little girly sprite, and Renata would bring you to visit, we knew you were going to be something magnificent when you matured.
Renata and I tried to get Odicum to add magic to your curriculum when you were being schooled, but he was grooming you to be a warrior/diplomat. When you weren't studying language, history, and civic law, you were in the fields of Ranigar with Captain Janirid, learning swordplay and archery. When you had free time, you were usually off to Dawn Avarice to play with all your gnomish friends. There just wasn't time to instruct you in the magical arts. But it would appear you are a natural, dearie. Yet even so, Renata and I must school you up. I don't know what Minerva's plans for you are, but from what I've seen thus far, and been told by Pellegru and Darvis prior to setting out to Rorsch, she wants you at the very least to be captive. At most, I fear to venture a hypothesis. But my dear niece, I want you fully prepared for whatever Minerva's next move shall be. In fact, it is imperative.
Shanaeah responded.
Magic always has come natural to me. I had never worked any major spells until tonight, but the rudimentary spells Mother taught me came pretty effortlessly. Casting those spells on Minerva felt like second nature.
Deneen responded.
Your schooling in languages helped you there as well. Knowing the definition of the words in a spell makes the words carry more weight when spoken.
Ganaranese, were they not?
Yes, my dear,
Answered Deneen.
the large majority of verbiage used in spells is Ganaranese. It was once the common tongue of Aeros, before the Bartanian elves hunted them into extinction.
Yes, I recall the plight of the Ganaranese from my studies. A shame, really. They were an articulate and intelligent people.
They were indeed. Unfortunately, they weren't very warlike, and the Bartanians routed them easily. But, as much as I would love to sit and discuss history with you, we had probably better think about going on to Pandania.
Jerome could see the towers of the Disselry rising above the treetops on the outskirts of Penichery, and he stopped for a second or two to stare. He originally planned to go cross-country, forsaking the Great River Road and the gnomish city of Dawn Avarice, going straight to Boniscus. But his gut told him to make first for Dawn Avarice. Why, he didn't know. But it seemed the thing to do, and since his plans had changed, instead of walking the 18 miles from the Disselry, where he now stood, to Dawn Avarice, he decided he'd save himself the legwork and hire a raft at Dissel Point, and ride down Dissel Creek to Dan's on Loch Dawn Avarice. It's just a short walk on to Dawn Avarice from there. If he gets a raftsman who isn't too talkative, he might be able to slip into Splendetta and apply some higher-level brain power to the situation at the Disselry. Leaving the Disselry behind, he pondered the conversations he'd had with Mathila and Parthis, while at the Splurt House in Harless. It was mildly troubling that merchants had noticed the torture at the Disselry. Reason being, merchants ranged from Port Parsis, on the eastern coast of the Aegean Sea, all the way over to Pinnegree, the capital city of the Bartane Elves, to Norton in the northwest, and the Four Cities in the northeast. This means the torture occurring at the Disselry would be common knowledge from one side of Aeros to the other soon, if not already. Surely Minerva considered this, which would mean she purposefully allowed that information to be spread. Otherwise, she would have simply confined the torture to the dungeons of Rorsch, which is off the beaten path, and merchants won't go near. Jerome wondered, what was her angle here? As the raft house at Dissel Point came into view, Jerome spotted Horace the proprietor sitting on the dock smoking a long-stemmed pipe. Horace waved a greeting to Jerome, and Jerome waved back. Horace, annoyed, had ran the raft house at Dissel Point for better than a decade. He was also mayor of Dissel Point, self-elected since he and his wife Thula were the only residents.
What news from Norton, friend Jerome?
Horace asked.
None this time, friend Horace. Never made it that far. Spent the night in Harless.
Ah, an evening at the Maid. Had ourselves a bit of foolishment, did we?
We did indeed. Sweet little gnome named Shanaeah. If you get a chance, you should give her a try.
Now, Mr. Jerome, you know Thula don't allow me no strange encounters. She may be the one jealous woman in all of Aeros, but that don't bother me none.
Thula's stuff is as sweet as it can be.
I'm sure it is. Your wife is a very pretty lady.
Well, thank you, friend. Now, what can I do for you today?
I need to raft down to Dan's. How soon can you fix me up?
Well, I ain't got but one raft running today. Got a raftsman took sick a week ago. Word is the healers fixed him up good, but it still might be another week before he's strong enough to guide a raft down, much less upstream. Gentry is the only raftsman I got today, and I reckon it's going to be another hour before he's back from the run he's on. There's some ale cooling in the stream there by the dock. Pull it up and have a draw.
Thanks, Horace. I believe I will.
Minerva was beside herself with rage. Yarnella, one of the witches she had stationed in Rorsch, and Magda, her personal assistant, stood and watched as Minerva unleashed her rage on Crimmage.
You ignorant fucknugget. How could you be so stupid as to have removed her condyle?
Crimmage was strapped to the coital torture table, much in the same manner Shanaeah had been. Minerva stood in the gap at the foot end, and the instruments from the chest were laid out and ready.
Madam, please. I never removed her condyle, I swears to ye.
Really? Shitstain? Then how did it get off her wrist? No magic can remove a condyle from one's own wrist. There were no other witches present when you fed her to recite the incantation to remove it. The only other way for a condyle to be removed is by the one who actually placed it on the prisoner's wrist, which would be you, Crimmage. Lying to me is not wise at this juncture, little ogre.
With that, Minerva applied one of the instruments to the poor ogre. Minerva increased the pace. She was showing absolutely no mercy to poor Crimmage whatsoever.
Ready to end this, little ogre?
Yes, madame.
At that moment, Minerva raised her left hand above her head. Clutched in her long webbed fingers was a dussel dart. Yarnella and Magda could see the yellow feathers of the dussel dart as Minerva drove it into Crimmage's neck. Crimmage would never leave the table. Not under his own power anyways.
Never again will you fail me, little ogre. Never again.